Hey everyone, welcome to YouTube. Welcome to our Friday live show. I'm pretty excited about today's show. So if you're just getting in, make sure that you say hello and let us know where you're calling in from. And we'll get into it right away here. So just put it up in the chat window there. Today we're going to be talking about living larders. And so if you've never heard about that, you can just stay put, and we're going to get into what a living larder is and why it's important. I think it's a wonderful analogy with regards to what permaculture is all about. So I'm really excited to get into today's show. And I am going to be discussing living larders. I just wrote a blog about this. It's going to be a multi-part series on living larders. And if you want to get that blog, then you can sign up for our newsletter. We're going to end up submitting it to the newsletter as well. And there's going to be some additional information that we probably won't get time to cover today. We'll try, but if we don't, then you'll have a written record of it as well. So you can sign up for our newsletter with that link there, and it will take you to a page. You'll also end up getting our free blog book, which we can talk a little bit more towards the end of today's show. All right, let's get into it, guys. Just gonna share my screen here. And if someone could just do a quick sound check for me, I'd really appreciate it. How's the sound coming across for you guys there? All right, so living larders. What the heck are living larders? Check 1, 2, 3. So I'm assuming, Josh, that means the sound's coming in okay. All right, so I just wanted to start with a quote out of Dave Jackie's Edible Forest Gardens. If you've never seen this book, it's a really great book. Maybe somebody can find an image of it online and post it up onto the chat window there. It's Edible Forest Gardens Volume 1 and 2. And this comes right out of his book. So I want to just read it to you guys, and by all means read along with me. Recent studies indicate that the quote-unquote wild, untamed landscape we imagine the earliest colonists found was, at minimum, strongly human influenced. In fact, the primeval forest was probably a managed ecosystem. Some authors go even further, and they suggest that the eastern forest was and is, except in the remotest parts, a cultural phenomenon. Even before European colonization, the native peoples had widespread influence on their habitat besides the direct impacts of their farming. They managed the forest to increase and diversify their food supply and to improve their living conditions in general. So I think this is really getting to the heart of what a living larder actually is. And a lot of people find this very interesting in that they don't necessarily realize that the indigenous people of North America were farmers, and that they were actually managing their landscape in such a way to increase their chance of survival. A lot of people think about the indigenous people of North America as just hunter-gatherers, or there's lots of nasty words that have been used to describe them, but they are actually brilliant people, far more brilliant than we have generally given them credit for. And so I think when we talk about living larders, we're actually just talking about going back to how this land was managed 400 or 500 years ago, depending on which part of the country you're talking about. There's some estimates that Dave Jackie talks about in his book, which refer to this idea that there were 8 to 12 million people living on the eastern part of the United States, just off of these perennially managed systems. And so in permaculture, we call this a forest garden, but the concept of a living larder is much larger than just a forest garden. And so we'll get into some of those things tonight or this afternoon. So Bill Mollison did a YouTube series. Actually, he did a video series that's now on YouTube called In Grave Danger of Falling Food. And I highly recommend you watch it if you haven't already watched it. I think it's a 5-part series, and he talks about all the reasons why industrial agriculture is failing, essentially, and potentially going to fall. And it's a really great series, and it's one of Bill's great pieces of work that are worth looking at. And he goes around all different ecosystems to try and understand how permaculture can be applied at multiple scales, but in also different contexts and different climates. It's one of the first videos that I watched before getting into permaculture. So I recommend checking it out. And if somebody reminds me at the end, I'll happily place those links for you to check out. Bill's got some great quotes, and this is one of his great quotes. The greatest change we need to make is from consumption to production, even if it's on a small scale in our own gardens. If only 10% of us do this, there's enough for everyone, and hence the futility of revolutionaries who have no gardens, who depend on the very system they attack, and who produce words and bullets and not food and shelter. So I really love this. There's lots of things going on here. Number one, the 10% number is one that I don't think people really realize. The world depends on growing GDP, the world economy. And we can actually redirect the world economy by just gardening. It's crazy. It's that simple. We just need to produce more of our own food. And in doing so, we'll end up changing the course of history. That sounds like a completely crazy thing, but Jeff Lawton's got another quote basically saying all the world's problems can be solved in the garden. And that is kind of getting at the same sort of thing. We just need to start sorting out our supply chains, essentially. We all depend on consuming all the time. And I'm not saying people on this channel are necessarily consuming, but a lot of us in North America consume. And so if even just a small percentage of us started to produce more of our own produce, things would change. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this, kind of the impetus, if you will. And if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I use this concept called the Black Swan. It's not my concept. It's a concept that Nassim Nicholas Taleb launched to the world in his book called A Black Swan, or The Black Swan. And the premise is that all major changes that happen in humanity, at least most of them, are the result of black swans. So black swans are massive events that have huge implications, that are unpredictable. And once they happen, people say in happenstance or in hindsight that they saw it coming. And you can't see these things coming. And it's really difficult to predict what will end up kicking off a black swan. And so Taleb's solution to black swans has always been that you need to identify the systems that are fragile, that you depend on. And so he's always coming at it from the perspective of the financial system. But we can do this in everything. We can do this in our food systems, in our water systems, in our energy systems, in our community systems, in our, even within business. Like, where are we susceptible to things within our business, or what parts of our business are susceptible to black swans? And then once you identify those fragilities, or those systems that you depend on that are fragile, is a better way of saying it, then from there, what we can do is understand what sorts of actions we can take in order to ensure ourselves against the failure of a specific system that might be fragile or susceptible to black swans. So this is just a small number of systems that have global consequence to all of us who enjoy eating 3 times a day. And I would say are highly black swan prone. Now, in saying this, it doesn't mean I'm not coming out and saying all of these things are going to happen and that they're going to be the downfall of the modern food system. What I'm saying is that they are built upon a house of cards, a lot of them. They are susceptible to black swans. They are highly fragile, and the loss of any one of these things, or a change in the state of any one of these things, will end up being catastrophic globally, not just for the people that have to deal with it within their small little region. So the image that I've got to the right is the Ogallala Aquifer, and I'll get to that in a second. But peak phosphorus, most people don't realize this, but there's about 20 years of phosphorus left on the planet. Okay, now it's really important to understand what I'm saying here, because if there are some scientists or chemists on the call today, you're going to call me out on that comment because it's not technically accurate. So I want to just build that out a little bit before you jump down my throat. Phosphorus right now is currently mined in the form of soft rock phosphorus, and most of it actually comes from Africa. And that phosphorus then goes through a double acid process to make it water soluble. There are actually wars in the past that have been fought over phosphorus. The Falkland Wars in just off the coast of South America, basically islands that had immense amounts of guano, and that was the global supply of phosphorus before other phosphorus reserves are found. Now, two things. One, we don't actually need to mine phosphorus for plants to live. There's enough phosphorus in the soil for plants to thrive forevermore, pretty much. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is that phosphorus is actually cycled through fungal pathways, fungal hyphae. Fungi are able to go out into the soil and mine phosphorus that's not available to plants, or even available to mining equipment for that matter, because the tips of the mycelium actually exude acid. And when they exude that acid, they'll go out and seek phosphorus, bring it back to the plant, and then the plant will exchange sugars, because the fungi can't photosynthesize, in exchange for the phosphorus. So there's plenty of phosphorus in the world for plants. So we can grow all the food that we need. Phosphorus is not going to be a limiting factor. However, when you rototill, when you spray herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, and fertilizers, you kill the fungal networks in the soil that make that phosphorus plant available. So that's the first thing to know. The second thing to know is that phosphorus is elemental. So it's already at its simplest form, which means that you'll never actually run out of phosphorus. Phosphorus just needs to be cycled. It's not like ammonia, which is NH3, or ammonium, which is NH4. It's elemental, it's atomic, it's listed on the periodic table of elements. And so as long as you're working with no-till systems or low-till systems that are not using herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers, then you don't really need to worry too much about phosphorus. And so this is one of the main reasons why we have to move away from industrial agriculture, is that industrial agriculture that depends on massive amounts of disturbance requires massive amounts of phosphorus going into the system. So we have to change the way agriculture works. And at the very least, we have to start growing more of our own food that works with fungal networks and not against them. Right now, and I've said this a couple times on our channel, but there's 10 calories of energy that go into producing 1 calorie of food. So that's fossil fuel in, that's herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, harvesting, transport, food processing, packaging, refrigeration, sending it to the store, going and picking it up, bringing it home, cooking and eating it. So if we were all coyotes, we would all die if we had to invest 10 of our own calories into every calorie of food that we consume. And so this is a really big problem. And the impetus here is that if you take the fossil fuel out of the system, we're all going to starve. And so there's a lot of evidence that we have reached peak oil. Different people will tell you different things. It doesn't really matter when peak oil happens, whether it's now or whether it's in 50 years or 100 years from now. We're talking about the end of agriculture without fossil fuels. Now, you could argue that we can use battery-powered tractors and all of that other stuff. Sure, we can have that conversation, but there's all sorts of other reasons why agriculture has to come to an end. Right now, we need 7 tons of topsoil. In other words, we lose 7 tons of topsoil for every ton of grain that's produced. And if you guys want a reference to that, check out Dr. Christine Jones's website, Amazing Carbon, on the internet. So right now we're basically trading soil for grain. It's insane. The whole conversation around why we should all be vegans or vegetarians just totally breaks when you just look at this one thing alone. Both of the last two, the 10 calories in for 1 calorie out, 7 tons of soil for every ton of grain. Properly managed livestock does not lose soil. It actually grows soil. It puts carbon back into the ground. So we cannot continue to run agriculture on 7 tons of soil per ton of grain. The Ogallala Aquifer, I promise, guys, just before I get into this next one, I will get to an optimistic point here. I just want to build the case for these living larders, okay? The Ogallala Aquifer has maybe a decade left. And this is, responsible for anywhere from 7 to 14% of the global grain crop. So most of the states that are represented on this map use some form of irrigation from the Ogallala Aquifer in order to produce corn, soy, wheat, cotton. They're drawing it down faster than they've ever drawn it down with all the droughts that we've been having, and it's not going to end well. This aquifer is never going to come back to the way that it was, and so we cannot require these states in the United States to produce food for a global system. It just doesn't make sense. And in fact, we should actually look at what these states do really well from an agroecological perspective and grow that instead of trying to force function things to grow that shouldn't be growing there. Peak pollination, I don't think we need to talk about much about that, but bees are on the decline. We need to change our ways in order to bring the bees back. And peak farmers, most farmers are in their 60s, and so we're running out of people to actually operate these properties. So there's lots of reasons why we have to change our ways, and if we don't change our ways, a black swan will emerge and will force us to change, and it may not be pretty. And so one of the reasons that I do what I do is to show people another way, show people a way that takes away all of these problems in one swoop. And Bill Mollison has another quote, which basically goes something like, though the problems of the world are increasingly complex, the solutions still remain embarrassingly simple. And I really feel that that kind of gets to the essence of where we're going in the next slide. So living larders are a potential solution. And let's just define what a living larder is. So living larders are pre-existing or designed cycles and niches in nature that are biologically living flora or fauna food sources that human can harvest when needed without having to store them in a traditional root cellar or larder. So essentially, imagine a food system that you design on your property that's either wild or cultivated, self-managing and cultivated. So in the sense that it's, domesticated and self-managing, that just produces, right? And this is what the indigenous people on the eastern seaboard of North America had figured out. They had figured out how to propagate perennial plants that didn't need to be planted every single year with heavy equipment, because it didn't exist, and nor did the fossil fuels to run them, to produce their food in a way that was effortless. And, it's amazing how often we end up on working with farmers who are, and I'm not trying to pick on farmers. This is the same sort of mentality that happens in the cities too. So don't take this in the wrong way. But we'll go there and they'll be fighting against a weed, or they'll be fighting against prairie dogs or something like that, instead of actually trying to understand what's going on in that system and saying, well, perhaps the prairie dog or this weed is actually worth more than the crop that I'm trying to grow. And how can I use the fact that this ecosystem wants to produce prairie dogs and these specific, these specific weeds, and work with that system as opposed to constantly trying to fight against it. And so living larders is a step toward that, basically saying, okay, what does this ecosystem want to grow? What does it do really, really well? And how can we enhance those pre-existing conditions in order to make growing food, storing food, removing myself from the need to get my food from an industrial food system easier? And that's really the crux of it, essentially. So permaculture gives us the tools to design these systems. And I mean, if you want to think about permaculture gardening or permaculture farming, that's what this is all about. It's about creating living larders that support humans and ecosystems. So these are no-till garden beds. I mean, those are not so much living larders. Those are actually just garden systems, but food forests and aquaculture ponds and enhancing wild spaces so that the existing flora and fauna can flourish around you. And that's really the premise. And I should just mention that this is something that Dakota Cohen, who's been on this channel a couple of times now, and I were coming back from a consultancy, and we were just thinking about how hard we make it for ourselves as humans and how we constantly try to force function certain products or yields or systems onto properties. And so as a result of about a 2-hour conversation around this whole idea about how hard we make it, we came up with this concept of living larders. And we called them a couple of different things: living larders, biological food reserves, essentially creating spaces on people's properties where if they planted them and they set them up, they could just do nothing to them and they would just accumulate calories, essentially. And so that was where this whole concept started to emerge. And it was a really exciting concept. And I finally got some time to write these concepts down onto a piece of paper and to create a few principles, which is what we're going to go through right now. So principle number 1, looking for pre-existing larders. And so number 1, what you want to do is go out and assess your biological resources in your surrounding area before imposing new flora or fauna on any system. Assess if there are activities you can do to enhance these natural resources. And I mean, this is a direct observation of what the indigenous people were doing in North America, using fire as a way of managing ecosystems. So what they would do is they'd find areas where there was dense forest, and they would literally chop and drop or burn areas to open up more sunlight so that additional forage could grow, so that they could increase the deer or the bison or the elk or the moose populations, depending on what species wanted to eat what and where they wanted to be and what that limiting resource constraint actually was within that specific ecosystem. And so one of the first things that we do as consultants when we get hired on a project through adaptive habitat is we go and assess what's going on in the existing bioregion and what are the things that we can do in order to enhance those things. And so we were on one property once where it was full of wild turkeys. And the individual there wanted to increase their cattle population, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with cows. But when we did an assessment of how many wild turkeys was on this property, we realized that there was more pounds of wild turkey running around this property than there were pounds of cattle, and they had quite a few cows on the property itself. And so the property was expressing itself as wild turkey, as a productive wild turkey system, essentially. And the great thing with the turkeys was that the turkeys required no input. They didn't need feeding. They didn't need the farmer to get up at 3 a.m. in the morning to go and feed them. They didn't need, veterinarian services. They just kind of figured it out. And they were thriving off of the hordes and hordes of grasshoppers that were eating all the forage that the cows wanted to eat. And so they didn't have a turkey problem. They didn't have a grasshopper problem. They actually had a turkey opportunity that they just had to be a little bit more creative with in terms of how to enhance that system and then figure out how to profit from it, both ecologically, but also potentially financially. It's about being creative and turning those problems into solutions, essentially. So we want to assess the things that are growing around us. And so sometimes this can take different pathways, essentially. One of the other reasons that we want to assess what's going on around us is that when we get into designing food forests, as an example, we want to look at the species growing in the surrounding area from a tree perspective, because we can use the knowledge of specific trees to create analogous trees that will work within that system. So for example, if you saw that there were jack pines growing everywhere in your ecosystem, then you might say that an analogous plant to the jack pine would be the Korean stone pine or the Swiss stone pine, which produces pine nuts. Or if you saw turkeys growing in your bioregion, you might say that you're a good selection of fauna in your bioregion might be some sort of cultivated or heritage breed turkey. So we want to go in and spend a lot of time kind of assessing the ecosystem before we try and change anything. That's really important. Principle number 2 is cultivated flora larders. And so by flora, I mean plants. And I was just talking a little bit about food forests. So cultivated flora larders should consist of perennial and self-seeding annuals that require minimal tending And these include terrestrial and aquatic systems. So we have plants growing in both water and on land. And essentially, the way that this typically looks in cities and on farms is usually the first thing people think about is food forests. Now, food forests are multi-layered tree, shrub, and herb systems that will that self-manage once they're established, and they just constantly crop, and they'll crop forevermore. You don't have to go in and plant them with a no-till seed drill. They just continually to produce. And the trick is trying to figure out how to maximize the number of layers in a system so that you're getting productivity out of every different layer in the food forest. And within food forests, we can actually integrate other systems in there as well, like fauna systems. So that could be chickens or rabbits and things like that. Now, the trick here is remembering that what we're talking about this is different than annual gardening, because once we plant a food forest and it's up and it's established, it needs very little management in order to continue to produce. And so that's why we're calling it a living larder. It's living, and so it's got stored food on its branches. It's got the ability to produce without any additional input once it's established. And so it really does kind of fill that niche. When we talk about aquatic systems, there's all sorts of aquatic plants, bulrushes, duck potato, lily roots, even duckweed. There's all sorts of plants that can grow in aquatic systems that will fulfill the same function. And these things will just grow all on their own. They just accumulate over time. They increase their density, and they're there if you ever need them. And so that's the other kind of thing that we help people with, is helping people to create emergency food systems. Now, a larder is also known as a root cellar, and it's a place where we store food. But if your food is stored in the ground and you only harvest it when you need it, that's an incredible source of resilience, because you don't have to go out and actually pull that food out of the ground every year unless you want to. And you know that because of the nature of that specific type of plant that you're growing, let's use bulrush or cattail as an example. Both of those plants are edible. Those plants store energy in their roots, which we can eat. They store energy in the pollen, which you can also eat. You can even eat the shoots coming out of the ground in the early spring, and they taste a little bit like asparagus. These are systems that just want to live, and all we have to do is know that they're edible and put them all over our property, and now we've got a source of food. Now, sometimes these plants are not going to be ones that we're going to want to directly eat, and so we might grow living larders for our livestock. And so we might feed these wetland plants to our pigs. And so it's a source of feed that we don't have to go out and cultivate all the time. It's just there. And there's all sorts of benefits of that, because especially when we start getting aquatic plants are generally more productive than terrestrial ones. They're just there for the taking. And we generally don't even think about them. They just kind of sit in the background without us really realizing what's going on. So principle number 3 is cultivated fauna larders. And so I've talked about the example of wild turkeys. It's always amazing to me how many people love to just kill prairie dogs all the time. And they don't do anything with them. They just shoot them and that's it. They're gone. And, they let them sit there and rot. And I use this example because, again, Dakota Cohen, a friend of mine who I mentioned a couple of times in this show already, he looks at the prairie dogs as an opportunity. I mean, they're not just a nuisance. They're actually performing a function. They're aerating the soil, they're creating water harvesting opportunities, but they're also a source of protein. And so he actually harvests some of his prairie dogs, not all of them. He doesn't eradicate them, and he feeds them to his pigs. And so instead of having to go out and buy protein supplements or find other unique ways to get protein into his animals, he feeds his small pigs prairie dogs. And I think it's an absolutely brilliant adaptation to using prairie dogs as an opportunity, as opposed to always looking at it as a problem. The turkey example we've already talked about. In aquatic systems, fish, once they're established in a pond, there's lots of ways to enhance the productivity of that pond, so that once the pond is stocked with fish, it just continually increases in productivity. So trout are a great example. In ponds, we want to increase the crenulation on the edges, because that's what increases the amount of insects available. You can also put solar powered lights on top of rafts in order to encourage more bugs to where the fish are, to bring bugs down to the surface, which will again help to increase their productivity. And, you know, bugs are a free and available resource that generally don't get put to productive use, and most of us love to hate them. So why not integrate a pond that has flora, so all of the, you know, duck potato, duckweed, bulrushes, cattails, and various other wetland type plants. And in addition to that, also has a whole trophic series of fish in there that you can consume. So everything from stickleback all the way up to brook trout and rainbow trout, if it's legal in your bioregion, I should mention. And now you've got this pond that's full of both flora, plants, and animals that you can consume or your livestock can consume. And so it's about really looking at all the different ways that we can store food, not just in our root cellar, not just in our gardens, but also in our cultivated and non-cultivated wild spaces that are just asking us to go in and consume them and also help potentially propagate them. So a couple of additional insights I just want to share with you guys. Dan Flores, who wrote American Serengeti, which is an amazing book. I haven't actually read it yet, but I've read reviews on it and I've read some quotes from him. States that when the bison were roaming North America, there's anywhere from 30 to 60 million bison, you know, going across the plains, which is more cows than we even have right now. And I think this is a really important fact for a lot of reasons. Number one, there's this huge campaign against cows right now. It's insane. And what's crazy about this is everybody's blaming climate change on cattle. Climate change is not caused by cattle. Maybe confined animal feeding operations are causing some of the climate change issues that people are talking about. But we know for a fact that the bison were the primary reason that the soils in North America are as good as they are. They cultivated the soils. They grew them through active grasslands. If we want to halt climate change, we'll actually get rid of all the corn, soy, wheat, canola, all the annual crops that are causing all this massive soil erosion, the dead zones in the ocean. We'll plant them back to grass, which are carbon sequestration mechanisms, and we'll put 30 to 60 million cows or bison or a combination thereof back onto the North American plains again. That's how we're going to put the carbon back into the soil that we've eradicated through the use of annual cropping systems. That's the crux of this. Anybody that says anything else doesn't understand the, you know, basic physics. Essentially, there's some fundamental physics involved in some of these claims that people are making about turning the world into veganism or vegetarianism. And I'm not saying that veganism and vegetarianism can't be a sustainable diet. It just needs to be done within the right context. If you really want to live a vegetarian or vegan diet, go live in the subtropics or the tropics. That's where you're going to have a sustainable dietary regime there. In our ecosystem, though, this has been how it has operated in the past, and we know that it was successful. And this is the ultimate living larder. I mean, can you imagine how many calories were stored in those bison? Unbelievable. And yet we've derated the system. We've made the system less productive than it was, not because it's purely out of ignorance. I mean, it's purely out of ignorance and our desire to own things and control things. And I'm not saying that we're going to go back to the way that we used to manage land. That's not what this is about. But I am saying is that there are some very valuable lessons from the past that we can bring into the future. And there are ways that we can manage our land in the same way that the bison and the wolf managed the land in the, before we got involved and put fences up everywhere. And this is a great analogy to what the indigenous people knew 400 years ago when they were managing these systems. And not every indigenous population managed in the same way or necessarily managed in the most positive way. There are good examples and bad examples, just like everything. There is no good and bad. There are just different shades of gray, essentially. But that's not to say that there aren't really important lessons when we look back on how things were as we try to plot our course going forward. So I have a whole 3-part blog that will be coming out sometime in the next month. If you would like to be notified when that comes out, you can join our mailing list. Here's the link. I'll make sure I put it in the show notes below as well. So I'll just leave that up on the screen for a few minutes. You can copy that down. That's the newsletter opt-in on our website. And when you opt in for that, you get our free blog book, which has all of our blogs in a magazine style layout. We've had enormous positive feedback from this blog book. It's loaded with all of our best blogs, so I encourage you to check it out. And I will post that in the show notes a little bit later. I can also put a link up into the chat window right here. And you're welcome to click on that. If somebody can just check to make sure that that works, that'd be great. So folks, I've got time for questions if you guys are interested. By all means, post your questions up into the chat window, anything to do with living larders or anything to do with permaculture for that matter. And I'll leave this link up for a little bit, and I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any resources that you guys are interested in having regarding this topic. Just going back and looking at some of your comments here. If you found this valuable, guys, too, I'd love it if you guys hit the like button. It's great feedback for me. Just shows me that I'm doing the right thing. That'd be great. Yvonne has a comment, or actually Field B, the aquifer situation qualifies as a real emergency. 10-year supply at current rate of use. Is there a good reference source for that estimate we can use? You know, Field B, if you just Google Ogallala aquifer shortages or running out, you'll find a whole bunch of articles. This is not new information. And none of the hydrologists are really arguing about it, but there's very few people that are actually talking about solutions. There is one, though. Wes Jackman, I think his name is one of the directors of the Land Institute, and he has been working tirelessly, I think for over a decade now, maybe 2 even, on the breeding of perennial grains. So these are grains that once you plant them, you never need to go and plant them again. So imagine going out and planting a field of grass that produce grain seed, and all you have to ever do is come and harvest them. And that harvesting could actually occur just by running your cows or your pigs or your chickens across the field instead of running and using a combine. So he's addressing the energy issue. He's addressing the water, the irrigation issue, because perennial plants generally have deeper roots than annual ones. And he's addressing the living larder concept. And he's using grasses that work within the region that we're currently growing. I mean, corn, wheat, these are all grasses. These are all grass species that we've cultivated in order to try and get the grains out of them, essentially. So if Wes Jackman succeeds at this, it'll be nothing short of revolutionary. I mean, you'll end up having some of the big agri-giants won't be able to sustain themselves anymore, because why would a farmer own all that planting equipment if he only has to plant his fields every few years, maybe even once a decade, maybe, depending on how the grasses work and all of that stuff, and if they self-replenish themselves, and if grazing helps to bring them back. You're talking about the end of herbicides, fertilizers, irrigation, a lot of tractor equipment. I mean, unbelievable change. So you can see why this guy has dedicated so much of his life to it. So check him out, the Land Institute. Really interesting dude. Yvonne, my grandfather lived on earth pit baked gopher when living in the brush in Northwest Territories. I wonder how prairie dogs taste. I bet you they're just like guinea pigs. I bet you they taste really great. Valley View Farm, hello from Eastern Saskatchewan. Richard Russ, hello from San Francisco. Hey, Richard. Freegan Dave Hartman, howdy from Southwest Montana. Nice to have you. Yvonne Watson, oops, 404 error. Yeah, I'm not sure why we're having that issue. Did the Bitly, let me try it on my side here too. Yeah, it doesn't work on mine either. That's interesting. Okay, well, I'll look into that. Thanks for checking that. I will put it in the show notes, and you guys can get the link there. Are there any questions about living larders, guys? Yeah, Field Bee. Yes, Wes Jackson, sorry, has been at it for decades. A perennial grain seed has been made available at the Land Institute. Great work. I totally agree. Yeah, he's a really interesting gentleman. So, Brent, hey Rob, was just wondering, what is your best and most productive larder that you have growing on your front yard currently? Oh man, we have lots of food growing on our property. I mean, in our ecosystem, I think one of the most productive terrestrial plants is sunchokes. So sunchokes are also known as Jerusalem artichokes. They produce up to 15 metric tons per acre. Now, I don't have an acre, but 15 metric tons per acre above ground and 15 metric tons below ground. So, and then they're self-seeding. So once they establish, they just keep establishing. And it's amazing how many gardeners get really mad because they call them invasive. The funny thing is, with plants that are invasive or that are referred to as invasive, I don't really believe in anything invasive. Nature does not run with sentiment like that. She's far more sophisticated than using words like invasive or concepts like invasive. They just need to be consumed more. I mean, what better plants to partner with than ones that spread rapidly? It just means that you have to use a little bit more design thinking before you go and just place them anywhere. And if they do end up taking over, you just need to eat them more. Which would be the best larders for startup, cheap and productive? Yeah, I mean, like, here's the thing, guys. You want to, there's cheap, there's productive, and then there's business opportunities as well. So I know there's a company out of Eastern Canada called Hope Seeds, and every year they're sold out of Jerusalem artichoke seed stock, which is basically just tubers that can be propagated. I think somebody should create a Living Larder seed bank, essentially. And so you'd have to go around and find your local, the plants that grow here. I'm going to give you guys a couple of interesting resources that I think will help. Yeah, exactly. Josh Steele, invasive. We were non-native once too. It's a slippery slope when you start going down that whole invasive thing. And I'm grateful that you brought that up, Josh. Okay, so let's get a couple of resources here for you guys, because I think you'll find these really valuable. So resource number one is Perennial Vegetables. I have this book. It's really great. And this is what it looks like. It's written by, what's his name? Eric Tonesmeyer. So you can take a peek at this, and depending on what USDA zone you're in, you'll find even plants for Canada. They've got from zone, I think, 2 or 3 all the way up to 12. So highly, highly recommend this book. It's a fantastic book by Eric Tonesmeyer. So by all means, go and get it. Let me know what you think of it if you do end up buying it. That's the first one. Edible Forest Gardens is a great book. Okay, so that's what that one looks like. By Dave Jackie. Highly recommend his books right here. 2-volume set. They're expensive, but they're absolutely packed with information. You can find Dave Jackie, some of his videos on YouTube as well. They're worth watching. Hope Seeds. Let's just go have a look. I haven't had a look at them this year. They sell, let's see if I can find, yeah, Jerusalem artichokes. So they've got 4 different cultivars now, which is great. And, you know, they're $10 for a pound, which doesn't sound like very much. But when you see how productive these plants are, you realize that, you know, at 15 metric tons, so that's 30,000 pounds basically per acre, you do the math on that, 30,000 times 10. So very, very productive crop. And so I think more of us should be producing these. These are an interesting plant. They don't all, not all of us can eat them. Some of these, some of us get really kind of gastrointestinal sickness as a result of eating them. So you'll have to try them in small doses. Another plant is perennial onions, or walking onions, or Egyptian onions is another one. I think there's one company that, let's see if I can find walking onions. that specializes in Egyptian onions. I think these guys are them maybe. These are really neat because they self-seed, and so they'll spread all over your garden, and you've got this amazing source of walking onions. Their seeds are produced on the top of the plant, and they fall over, and then they will self-plant themselves, and so they just kind of walk along your property, which is great. I really, really love Egyptian onions. Oca is another crop. It's not available for, you know, you have to be in a certain USDA zone, but they have small tubers, and they're perennial as well. And so if you live, I think it's USDA zone 4 or 5 to grow these. They're from Peru, so they're kind of like a potato, self-propagating. You've got Good King Henry, which is another plant that's an edible perennial salad green. You've also got sorrel is another one, another great plant. So there really are a whole bunch of them, and that's why I really recommend you guys get this book. This could be basically called Living Larders, Gardens for Living Larders, essentially. It's a really, really great book. So take a look at it, and let me know what you think. So let's go back to the chat window here. Calgary is 3B. You're absolutely right. Okay, so when our ground freezes solid in Calgary, could it be said that our larders are only seasonal? Maybe West Coast has more year-round system. Yeah, potentially, but there are ways that you can, I mean, I know gardeners, Nikki Jabbour, for example, wrote a book, and you know, she finds ways to harvest kale and carrots from the ground all the time. So there are ways to harvest even in the wintertime. You just have to get a bit creative about it. Seek to find. Families can start a larder at simplest levels, planting gardens or even house plants like sprouts, herbs, and lettuce, and can start the an extra food storage. So Vessi Seeds have lots of knowledge. Absolutely. Yacon tuber. Never even tried of it. Have you tried that up in, I think you're in Lloydminster. Have you tried Yacon up there? Rhubarb, asparagus, absolutely. These are all really great plants that you can put into your perennial food systems. Maine potato lady might have those walking onions too, organic too. Yeah, absolutely. So guys, if you have any more questions, by all means, ask me. I'm gonna keep this video. It's gonna end up going up onto YouTube, so you're welcome to watch it again. If you have any additional resources, once it's up on YouTube, I'd love for you guys to put it into the comment section below this video. Hopefully you found this interesting. We'll be back on Monday at noon for our live session next Monday. Have not decided on the topic yet, but if you're interested in signing in on that, that's 12 o'clock Mountain Standard Time on Monday. We've got Introduction to Permaculture next week at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on Wednesday. And then we'll have this show again next Friday with a new topic to be determined at 3 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. If you want to find out what topics we're going to be discussing on Monday and Friday, we will have that up on the website typically by Sunday. And we have a special section under resources on the Verge Permaculture site. I'll just show you that right now so you guys know where to look. Let me just, so if you go to vergepermaculture.ca, which is our website, and you go underneath resources, we've got a special tab called video right here. And under the video tab, we have the listing for what we're going to be talking about the following week. So if you ever want to see what we're going to be talking about on YouTube, just head over to vergepermaculture.ca and you'll find it. If you're interested in getting onto our newsletter, typically a pop-up will show up when you're on the website itself. So you can sign up for our newsletter right here. So that was under resources, get some guidance, and then sign up for our newsletter. And if you're interested in being on our newsletter, you'll get all sorts of updates on these YouTube videos, but also we've got our brand new blog book right here, which has got all of our best blogs in a magazine style format. We've been getting rave reviews ever since we put it out there. So I highly recommend getting a copy of that. And you can sign up right down here. There's no cost to you at all. So guys, thanks so much for signing in today. Hopefully you found that interesting. I'm interested in seeing you guys next week. If you guys are looking for anything in particular for me to do on YouTube, just shoot me an email or put a comment up on one of my videos. I'd love to hear from you. And again, if you found this interesting, please hit the like button down below. It helps the channel to track. And I'll see you guys all again in a couple of days.